Lloyd sets up, so we have a speaker that's probably not known to many of you, Lloyd Watts. He is an electrical engineer. In fact, he got his PhD at the best university on the planet. Which, where was it again?
Some say Caltech.
Oh, it's Caltech.
Indeed.
It was at Caltech with Carver Mead, who's one of the pioneers of the Silicon Revolution. In fact, for those of you who work at the Allan Institute, the building just next to us, just a little bit east of us on the other side of the bridge, is Impinj, which is another startup by another Carver Mead graduate, Christiorio. Lloyd, when he left, so he was one of the group of Carver that did what's called neuromorphic engineering. They try to take knowledge that we have from neurobiological circuit and try to build silicon replicas of that, both to help understand biology as well as to build useful products. Lloyd is really the one who took that into the market. So he spent some time in a number of Silicon Valley companies. Then he worked at Interval Research that Paul funded in the 90s, until finally he started a company called Audience. And most of you probably carry a product of Audience in your pockets that he's going to tell us about.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Just one sec to get my slides up here. Oh, there we are. Looks like we're done. Very good. Christoph, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It was a wonderful surprise a few months ago to find out about that. My interest here, rather different in contrast to the exploratory and the deep understanding of the new measurement techniques and so on that are being developed. My interest is in understanding the brain well enough that we could build a computer system that works like the brain, and entrepreneurial, like Paul Allan originally, building a company that could commercialize that kind of knowledge, make great products, and to have an entrepreneurial success based on that kind of understanding. So the founding idea of Audience in the year 2000, the mission was to reverse engineer the human hearing system, the accessible part of the brain that I thought we could begin with, commercialize with dedicated chip products, so it was going to be a chip company. Our first product was a 2-microphone noise reduction chip for cell phones, which was offered in 2007. It became a hit in 2010. That is, it was designed into products that we sold 100 million of in that year. We've sold 500 million of these little $1 chips. Basically, the business model was a $1 chip in every cell phone sold every year. That's all we ask, right? That would be $1.4 billion per year if we could get full market penetration, which we haven't, but that was the hope. Now let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind it. This picture is something that you can see anywhere on the internet. This is the conventional view of the human auditory pathway. It starts with the cochleus down at the bottom. You go into the cochlear nucleus in the lower part of the brainstem, superior olivary complex, nucleus of the lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, thalamus, medial geniculate body, and then auditory cortex. And if you look at this basic picture, it would appear that auditory cortex is the pinnacle, the high point of the whole game. And this is really all that I could get neuroscientists to tell me with any conviction or with any common point of view about it. The last decade has been when fMRI has told us more about what is happening up in cortex. Things were really only reasonably well understood at the brainstem level. Now, it turns out it was lucky that we were able to build a product that was based largely on just brainstem processing. So the neuroscience was sufficiently advanced that it could guide us to build a product and we could have a success with what we had at the time. We didn't know much about cortex, but we didn't need to know much about it in order to build a product. Here's an extraction of the functional block diagram. Is basically the back end looks like a speech recognizer. For the engineers in the audience that know the components of a speech recognizer, spectral smoothing is like the Kepstrom. If you know what the Kepstrom is, that's a conventional beginning of a speech recognizer. Speaker normalization, triphone probability estimation, often implemented by Gaussian mixture model. For those of you who are familiar with that, these are the conventional parts of a speech recognizer. Then you have a vocabulary database that informs a Viterbi search through a hidden Markov model space. If you don't know what those things are, that's fine, don't worry about it. But for those of you who do, you'll recognize this 3-block diagram, this architecture: spectral smoothing, phoneme probability estimation, and then Viterbi search through hidden Markov model space. That's going to come up later, so please remember those 3 blocks in an ascending pathway, that's the architecture of a speech recognizer. Now, one of the reasons that speech recognition works so poorly in practice is if you take it into a crowded bar or into your car when you're driving, you may notice that your speech recognizer doesn't work nearly as well. Human beings are amazingly noise robust. The reason that we're noise robust is because we don't just do speech recognition. Before we do speech recognition, we separate the speech out from all the incoming ambient sounds. And that is what we ended up commercializing. The part of the brain that comes before the cortical speech recognition, which is partly subcortical. This ended up being our first product. It takes sounds from the 2 ears, the cochleas, does spatial analysis to determine where is the sound coming from. Am I over here? Am I over there? That's the first thing your lower brain stem does. We extract the pitch, we group the sounds together to determine how the energy all flows together, and finally we choose the foreground. Patricia Kuhl was talking about the importance of attention. This is where you pay attention to my voice and you ignore the slamming door or the crying baby in the background and so on. Okay, so this is how we built our product. This is the chip that we first offered. It goes into a cell phone architecture here next to a baseband processor chip, typically offered by Qualcomm, for example. And this is the magical thing that it does for you.
Well, I hope so. You know, let's just go and we'll see, right? Okay? All right, great. Bye. See you later. Well, I hope so. You know, let's just go and we'll see, right? Okay? All right, great. Bye. See you later.
That is what your phone is doing for you right now. But because it's doing it for you, being heard by the person you're talking to, you're probably not aware that your phone is doing that for you. You may have had the experience of telling people, oh, you probably can't hear me because I'm in a really loud place right now. I'm right next to the speaker at a concert. Have you ever had them say, no, I can hear you just fine? If you have a modern smartphone, you may have had that experience. It's because of what our chip does for you. Okay, so now you know what our chip does. I'll skip that slide. Okay, so now in 2012, we know much more about what is happening in Cortex, where I had no guidance in 2001. The magic of fMRI has given very important researchers some new insights that were not available before. And I'm going to go through in some detail about this one, Hickok and Popple, 2007. I'll also make a little reference to Kriegstein and Gros, 2004, and there's also Peretz and Zator. But let's focus on this one. This is a summary diagram from Hickok and Popple, 2007, of the speech areas in the brain. And this part of the figure right here is what the anatomist sees. When you look at the surface of the cortex, you see the various regions, and they're connected together in their very complicated way. And in fact, Dr. Kuhl was describing this in various ways. The superior temporal gyrus she mentioned on one of her slides, and then you went up to Brokaw's area. Well, this is looking in detail at what those regions are. Now, in order to make it easy to understand, Hickok and Popple drew a little block diagram that mirrors the structure. So the top of the chain of this diagram, auditory cortex, is in fact the spectrotemporal analysis happening in the dorsal superior temporal gyrus, and that's that little green block right there. That's the starting of the process in Cortex. And it goes from that starting point primarily around this little clockwise path from green to yellow to pink to blue. So 5 steps, green, yellow, pink, blue, and it traverses through a set of functions that are basically spectrotemporal analysis, phonological network, that's where the phonemes are detected. And in Dr. Kuhl's talk, that's where the training is being done in those early 6-month-old, 9-month-old, if I got that right. Then you go to the lexical interface. That's where the words are stored and recognized. And what do you know? That has an input from above, the conceptual network. That would be the vocabulary. What vocabulary am I expecting to hear right now? So if I elephant throw a word in the middle of a sentence that makes no sense, you know exactly what I just did, and your little detector said, hey, wait a minute, that word didn't fit, but I know what he said, and it was a joke. You got it, okay? But it was an out-of-context vocabulary word. That's exactly what happened there. That's that little coming in branch. It shows you had an expected vocabulary, and I surprised you. Then you go to the combinatorial network, which is where the sequences of words and the probabilities of one word following another go, and then finally, articulatory network up at the top. That is the basic process of speech recognition in the brain in the primary ascending pathway. But now there's this other little path that goes this other way. Now this is interesting, and again, it ties to Dr. Cole's work. Spectrotemporal analysis, phonological network, but then you also go over here to the sensory-motor interface at the SPT, it's sometimes called Sylvian parieto-temporal junction, and then up again to a slightly different region of posterior inferior frontal gyrus. This pathway has to do with motor. So while we are recognizing speech on the primary pathway, we are also rehearsing, mimicking the sounds. Part of the way that we learn speech as a child is by babbling, mimicking the sounds, rehearsing the sounds that we make. This is part of learning to speak, which remains in place in the adult, but also helps us in adverse environments with a lot of noise or echo. When it's hard to hear, your tendency to mimic, you're building a little internal model of what I think I'm hearing to fill in the gaps and deal with the occlusions. When those things happen, you go through them because you're following, your little internal talker is following along with what I'm saying. Okay, so this is the architecture that we see. Now, as a computer guy, I want to build something that works like this. And so I'm looking for block diagrams. Anytime I see a paper with a block diagram, and I get all happy. Okay, that's something that I could build. Okay, so there's one block diagram. Maybe I can use that. Now over here, Kriegstein and Groh, 2004, this is the part of the brain that it has to do, it's an auditory portion of the brain, but now it has to do with speaker identification. How do you know my voice from Christoph's voice, for example? These are two people. And so here's another block diagram, and it doesn't look anything like the other block diagram. So at first it seems like this is not very useful. I'm expecting some common structure. So I went through the details of these papers and redrew them. Same content, but just unified them so that I could see the commonality between them. So I'm going to show you how I did that. This diagram here, the Hickok and Popple, there's the basic structure of it. Here's the redrawing into an ascending pathway with the little connections that go with it. So now the 5 blocks, spectrotemporal analysis here, the green one, ascending pathway all the way up through the yellow, 2 pinks and the blue. There's the ascending pathway. It splits off into the motor pathway here. That's the little counterclockwise piece, goes this way. Now there's a very interesting bit. People will often tell me, oh, you don't have to understand the brain, just work on building a speech recognizer. Just do good engineering. What does the brain study tell you about this? The brain ends up telling you things that you weren't looking for. And here is one of them. On this diagram here, you notice it says input from other sensory modalities into this motor block, the SPT. That shows up over here. It's the input to this little blue block over in this diagram. That's extremely interesting. That permits visual input to affect your comprehension of what phonemes you just heard. When would that be useful? In a really loud place, people augment their hearing by lip reading. That's how lip reading can help you comprehend the sounds you're getting. And one of the ways that we can tell that that's working, we know it works because if you contradict, if you give contradictory visual information, you get the McGurk effect. So I think that lip reading and McGurk effect could be explained here. I'm speculating a bit, but I think it could be explained through this pathway. There's another effect. Slipped my mind, so okay, but that's one of the important things that you can get from the reverse engineering of the brain is it tells you some things you wouldn't have expected, you wouldn't have built if you were just building the computer engineering thing. Okay, so now that's the architecture that we see. Now, I map it onto my present day working model of the brain. And now the path that we were just looking at is this part here, from auditory cortex through the various regions of Hickok and Popple up to posterior inferior frontal gyrus. The little split pathway over to SPT is here. And this is the part, this is now what Hickok and Popple described. Kriegstein and Groh, I read their paper and redrew. And when I redrew it, what do you know? I found an exactly parallel structure for speaker identification. Ascending, 3 little blocks, but instead of phonemes, words, and combinations, what I saw was the phonemic content as it relates to the identity of the speaker. The phonemes that sound like Lloyd, that make up Lloyd's identity. And then you go here to this next block, which is, oh, now I've put it all together into, this is the sounds of speech as creating an identity, but I don't know who it is yet. It's voices, but not identified yet. And then finally, you go up to this part, which is where they become identified. And what do you know? There's a connection to hippocampus. So that would make sense, because now when you meet a new person, you're hearing my voice probably for the first time tonight, if you remember what I said, you're going to update your memories, and so you'll be able to get access to the sound of my voice in the future from having made that update path. Okay, so this begins a general purpose architecture for hearing that is consistent with speech recognition, speaker identification, and also music perception. That's what I'm looking for, a general purpose architecture for how the brain handles these complex tasks, not just informed by one person's work, looking across multiple people. And what you'll see from me in future projects will be looking not just across auditory, but looking across visual and across motor and olfactory and so on. I'm trying to do the whole brain, ultimately, and now that I've had some success with the auditory project, I'm hoping to start working on the next part. Okay, keeping an eye on the time. Okay, so now, I'm an engineer, I build stuff. These stars represent things that I've actually built, working, real-time, high-resolution representations of those things. And I'm going to show you a quick video just to give you an idea what it looks like when you have every one of those representations running in real time. Your brain is doing it, and now I'm going to show you what your brain is doing. Like a control panel at a power station, everything that you're computing is happening here.
January 10th, May 4th, August 9th.
Okay, oh, sorry, didn't pause the way I expected. Let me.
January 10th.
One more time.
May 4th.
Okay, evidently pausing is not going to work for me. All right, so I guess I won't be able to pause that the way I absolutely thought I could. Okay, so these...
January 10th.
So can you turn down the volume a little bit? So I'll
August
speak over
9th.
it. Each of these is a different representation being computed by the brain. This is the spatial localization part here where the cursor is. Pitch here. Watch this part.
We were away a year.
Okay, did you see the moving blue thing in the trapezoidal space? Dr. Cole, that's for you. That is the articulatory space that maps the formant frequencies that you are hearing. It's the hearing part of speech sounds being mapped from that two-dimensional auditory space into a two-dimensional space of motor space, which is tongue position. We were away a year causes your tongue to move in a very simple two-dimensional space, tongue height and tongue forwardness. It doesn't have to be 13 or 39 dimensional like the speech recognizers guys have to build to make it work. It's really a two-dimensional movement, approximately, and that was characterizing it. What I'm looking for is simple, powerful representations that capture everything you need to do in a more efficient way. Okay, so I'm getting ready to wrap up. I'm not sure if my time, I have another 5 minutes or so? 4 minutes, good, good. Okay, so, oops, what happened to the water? Took away my water, 1 sec. Here we are, right here, okay. So, can we derive anything general from this? That's what we're looking for. I study particular regions of the brain so I can see what they're doing, and then hopefully, if I'm doing this right, we should find that the lessons we learn from that apply to other things, and we want to keep the things that turn out to be powerful in general. So here are the things that I have found so far after about 20 years of working on this, including Caltech all the way through interval and audience. Brains are using high-resolution representations of the world computed in real time with low latency. The real time and low latency means the work that I do is very different from the MATLAB guys, right? MATLAB guys are doing file-based processing that runs overnight and look at these graphs. No, I make movies that run in real time with high-resolution pictures because that's what the brain is doing. And it's got to be snappy, low latency, 20 milliseconds. Now, that helped me. What do you call creatures in the animal kingdom with slow hearing? Food, right? Because they get jumped on by something else. Right? So you've got to hear fast, real-time hearing. Now, that helped me. If I was just a MATLAB guy in the early days of the company, it turns out we had an evolutionary survival. There's a Darwinistic thing happening in business, right? What happens to you if you have a slow product? Your food in the business world, too. You don't make it because your product doesn't meet the requirements. In communications, for our noise suppression product, we had to have a product that delivered its answer. It found the voice, rejected the noise, and we had 20 milliseconds to cough up an answer. 20 milliseconds is a really tight time budget in order to make these kinds of decisions. So it turns out that the human constraint of real-time low latency was exactly the product constraint, real-time low latency. So we were already bench pressing 400 pounds, and when the time came for us to actually do something in business, we were in shape, and we could actually do it. Okay, so the next picture, it's a common engineering view. This is actually a quotation from one of my technical advisory board members, who I respect extremely much, Dr. Hinek Hermansky. This is a picture from his 1980 paper on speech recognition, and it was a cautionary tale to guys like me who would come along and say, we got to do human-like brain processing. He said, you should all remember that the purpose of a speech recognition system is to take the 40 kilobit per second speech signal and reduce it down to the 50 bit per second character string, which is popping out at the end. It's the recognized words. And so a speech recognizer should be progressively reducing the bandwidth of the signal down to this little trickle of just the recognized words. And at first, I mean, my advisors were very, very valuable to me, but I remember debating with him at first, and finally I realized, okay, it was good advice in the 70s when you had a tiny little processor and all you could do was this. You couldn't do anything more than that. Okay? But nowadays we don't. Moore's law has given us the gift of massive amounts of processing. And this picture here, this is my diagram of what the brain is really doing. Now, so let me describe why it looks so different. First of all, most of the time you don't just get speech at the 40 kilobit per second. You get speech plus slamming door, crying baby, car noise, all the other stuff. And generally, all that comes in. And the first thing you've got to do is separate the speech out from the other sounds. That's what all that brainstem stuff is doing down at the bottom before you get to the cortical recognizer. You've got to separate all that stuff. Then, by the time you're done, now, once you've separated it, now, yeah, you get your 50 bits per second out from the recognized voice, but you also get the identity of the speaker. You know it's me. You can't not know that it's me, right? You know where I am in the room, because I'm over here. Nope, I'm over there. You get my position, my spatial position, my identity, my emotion, my pitch of my voice. You get it all, right? And those things all help you to derive the 50 bit per second. Right? So the brain is doing a much more comprehensive thing. It's not, Carver used to say, don't throw away any information. The point of this diagram is exactly to throw away as much as you can as fast as you can. The brain is keeping as much as it can and using it to derive the best quality answer because your survival depends on it. And my belief, where's Gary? Gary Marcus? My belief, and we're hoping that we'll prove it again in another company, is that by adhering to this kind of principle will, as it did with audience, give us a competitive advantage in business, that we're willing to do this thing that is so much harder that no one else is willing to do it, and that means we get to win because we're solving the harder problems first. And that strategy worked for us at Audience. We were able to beat our competitors because we had a brain-like solution that kicked apart their beamformers. It was that easy. Okay, last a few comments here. Something that will surprise the hardcore neuroscientist, well, every neuroscientist, of course, you know the currency of the neuron is the spike. At least it's the primary way of communication. I know there's analog components there too, but you may be surprised to find that my neuroscience advisors, a panel of 7 top neuroscientists, all advise me, don't build your system with spikes. Don't do that. You would expect them to be the purists in the story, but they weren't. They said basically, you might need spikes in a couple of places. Octopus cells, superior olivary complex, you might get some advantage, and it turns out I did. But mostly, they said basically, spikes are just one of many ways you could encode. You can encode numbers with spike trains, or binary coded decimal, or hexadecimal. They're all equivalent. Just get the information processed, whatever coding method you do. So, surprise. That turned out to be extremely good advice because it meant that I didn't bother converting to spikes and then converting back. It would have taken effort to do that. I would have had to build a whole new language, and I would have had to have programmers that knew how to do all that stuff. By avoiding that, I got to tell them, no, just write your programs in C, which is a very good thing. Next thing, again, my respects to Paul Allan. Paul, I'm not sure if you remember, but in 1998, you came to my first Spike meeting where I'd been proposing that I would design chips to, at Interval, they wanted to build a chip design capability in those years, and they brought me in to do that. And so I proposed I'm going to reverse engineer the hearing pathway, and I'm going to be designing chips to do that. And Mr. Allan gave me an extremely good piece of advice. I took it, and I've been glad I did ever since. He said, don't bother building chips right now. It's way too early. Focus on the algorithms. Do you remember, sir, saying that? I will quote Mr. Allan. What he said was, don't go down that rat hole. You'll never come out again. That's exactly what you said. Sir, that was good advice. I took your advice. I never regretted it. And I'm going to take it again in the next company that I form, because the advice is still timely. Let Intel do the hard work of the chip design until you know what your product is going to be. Then when the time comes for VLSI, the time for VLSI is when you deploy a high-volume product for low cost. That's the time you turn it into a chip. But you wait until you know what the algorithms are. Mr. Allan's advice was right on the money. Many different algorithms appear to be running in Cortex, like associative memory, hidden Markov model, pattern matching, all kinds of things, not just one algorithm. Christoph uses the phrase to derisively describe oversimplification that some authors use. It's basically say that the Cortex is just a dinner napkin-sized sheet of 300 million of all the same thing, right? One algorithm to rule them all. Frankly, I agree with Christoph. I don't think it's one algorithm to rule them all. And I think if you look at, I interpret Dr. Cole's work as well, that there's some commonality, but as the organism develops, there's these windows where it opens, but certainly by the time you have the mature animal, the mature human being, it's a very different algorithm running in each different block. And that's what I see in my blocks. Finally, cortical specificity. Some of it is based on the windows, but other parts of it are based on the genes, as far as I can tell. If you don't have the FOXP2 gene, 2 base pairs missing in the FOXP2 gene, and you don't get an important component of human speech. So many of you probably know about that gene. I learned about it just recently on that, and that seemed to confirm cortical specificity is part of it. Finally, last two things. Neuroscience knowledge has been keeping up with computing capability as hoped in 2000. What I hoped, I built my company on the idea that computers would keep getting faster, Moore's law suggested they would, but also neuroscience knowledge would also keep getting better, and that they would stay roughly in lockstep. That every time the neuroscientist said, here's an algorithm that you could build, that the computers would be just fast enough to be able to do it. It was a bet, and it turns out it's been lucky and right for 13 years running. So there's something about this that suggests that they're actually independently tied together. The fact is the neuroscientists are getting better because the computers are able to process the data better. It's not independent things. They're getting better together for a reason, and you just got to get in the front of that wave, and now you're surfing, right? So, but that's worked out well. And Intel has been keeping up for my simulations. I haven't needed GPUs yet, any of those things. So that's my view on how to build systems based on how the brain works. The next company, so I retired 2 months ago from Audience, is a success, and frankly, it's got to the point where it doesn't need me anymore. I want to form new companies, and it can't take new company ideas. It needs to keep working, keep feeding the bulldog that it already owns, which is what David Liddell used to say at Interval. So I'm preparing to start new companies, and hoping that I can build on the previous success at Audience. So again, in closing, again, Mr. Allan, thank you for the support you gave to Audience. It's over a 15-year period. It was patient and visionary investment, and it made all the difference in the world. Thank you, sir.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you very much for that beautiful talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Gary.
I love the eclectic use of many algorithms. I think that's the right thing. I agree too many people are looking for one algorithm to rule them all. Yep. Question for you, though, is about your methodology. When do you, as a business person, throw overboard the neuroscience? So, for example, on the spiking, you said, I'm not going to do that. And yet, in some ways, you're trying to be very faithful to the neuroscience. Right. I mean, there could become a schism where you're faithful to something that doesn't really work, for example, if you don't have the spikings. How do you think about when to be faithful and when not?
Right. Well, so if feathers were needed for the planes, then we'd put them on. You know, if it actually helped the planes fly better, we'd add feathers or beaks or whatever it was that goes with it. So, in fact, the algorithms that I showed there, I know it went by so quickly, but the medial-superior olivary complex, in fact, did use a spike representation, but a very efficient one. I didn't do a Konishi-like delay line correlator, which would have taken 25 GOPS to be able to do that. I subtracted 2 timestamps, and I could do that in 100 MIPS, 100 kiloops, right? So you can use spikes, but you don't have to use them the way that the brain does either. You can do event-oriented things. So my mantra is be realistic at the level of the architecture, high resolution, real time, do what the neuroscientists say is getting done, get the result that way. But however you compute it, do it in the most efficient way on the processor you've got.
I mean, keeping away from the spiking representation was really a remarkable step, because it's sort of, in the neuromorphic community, it's sort of the common belief you have to have what's called spike event representation, but you chose a different road, and I think that's one of the reasons why.
It was sacrilegious.
And it was successful.
Yeah, the company was successful because I didn't spend 10 years going down that rat hole, and was able to focus on getting a product out sooner. So yes. If there's a lesson there's a lot of rat holes you can fall into. Try to avoid them all.
Don't we know?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Liv Robleski. I'm lucky I get to work for Dr. Cool. Hi, I'm over here.
Where are you? Oh, there. Thank you. Yes.
So from that Hickok paper, there's a dorsal pathway which uses the superior longitudinal fasciculus and the arcuate. That's on one side of the brain.
Yep.
And then the ventral pathway, which is
Yep.
like the external capsule.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you think the interpretation of those pathways are in the context of your algorithms.
Yeah. So the ventral one is the one that I described as the clockwise one. The 5 elements going this way, that's the one that I described as mapping rather naturally onto a conventional speech recognizer. And then the dorsal one is the counterclockwise one, and that's the one that's the split, the Y splitter over into the physical interface. It's where you're hearing along with it, mimicking, repeating the babbling and training components. So yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to describe, but I didn't name them when I was describing them.
So why is it that the ventral needs both sides of the?
Why is it the ventral needs the dorsal?
No, so the ventral's on both sides. And
On left and right.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't describe. In fact, I basically treated it as though it was all left, and I didn't describe the fact that on the right side there's a subset of all this. So there's on the right side of the brain there is a dorsal STG. So the green, yellow, and the first pink are there, but then they don't wrap around over to the right side. Now, one thing that I have seen, so when I was looking at the music perception papers and the speech perception papers, what you see is that you get this first 3 stages appearing on both sides in the left and right, but then the final speech specialization is on the left, right? And interestingly, Peretz and Zator, their papers were saying they see more of a specialization on the right. So it suggests music level processing appears in its mature form at the end on the right, speech is on the left. They share a bunch of stuff, and in fact, musicians often talk about the musical language, why certain pitches make sense here. There's a syntax to music. Interestingly, you saw in the video, music was what prompted me to get into this in the first place. So the interaction between speech and music to me is extremely important. Again, to Dr. Cole's paper, and perhaps to yours as well, is the importance in the learning process. You build a bigger brain, you build a more connected brain if you're exposed to speech and music at these early formative stages.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.